Hi, I'm Kevin Chua, art historian at Texas Tech University. I'm here with Lui Medina. Um, Louis, let's start talking about your art via your experience of living on an island. So let's say, in the Philippines, right? What was that like for you? It seems to come into your work in a number of ways.
Yeah, well, I mean, yeah, it does. You're right. It does come out in my practice quite a bit. And my whole experience of living in this, so to speak, archipelago, I mean, which it is, really affects how I view the world. And also, I mean, I believe it's a particular way of looking at the world. Um, so, like in my work, I sort of do a lot of research on landscape and the different kinds of landscape that I've experienced or I've been in when I travel. So, and I'm quite interested in it. There's one work that I always go back to is a particular image from the island down south, um, which I still use. And it's sort of kind of like almost like the base of a lot of the images that or a lot of the images that I have in my research, like that I document, and the landscapes that I try to capture, that I sort of work with it. Um, and I think it's interesting. I just find it interesting for myself as because um like it's a weird it's a completely different experience, like it's because a lot of the places that I've been to, that I work in, and I do residence in a lot, so lately has been very mountainous areas, so which is the polar opposite of my experience of living in islands and everything. It's even like the whole, like, navigating, trying to understand where you are at that moment, and the whole idea of place and navigating through areas that are surrounded by mountains is completely alien to me
weren't
in some
you weren't
ways.
specifically aiming for residencies in mountainous regions, were you? Were you just applying to like a bunch of residencies and
I
these?
particularly went for residencies in mountainous
Okay.
regions, you know um, and the reason why I still go back I chose that particular residency in Turin, which where do a lot of research in still um, is because it's quite near the Alps. It's at the foot of the Alps, and I still go back there, just so I can do more research on the place, and sort of like what it means to live in a place that's at the foot of the mountains. So, and that interests me because it sort of complements um, the place, like what the place that I grew up in, what I'm exposed to all the time, which is here, water. You know, I
Was
mean,
it
we have mountains, but it's all surrounded by water.
was it at the Turin residency that you did this work, which I'm sharing right now?
It started there, yes. So these
So
are actually on maps of the different mountainous areas around Turin, of Piemonte, that region. So it could be like the maps that will lead you towards like Switzerland, or through in between Italy and France, and even at the bottom, like, the other towns around Turin and then nearby. So it's and then what I found interesting is that because they're actually road and walking maps, so you can actually walk all those little paths they have there. And what particularly interested me in this work, in that map particularly, and that led to this work, is that it's just so like the whole idea of navigating through land for me is quite interesting, and it's something that I've never really done. You know, we don't have growing up in the Philippines, where obviously even in the cities urban planning doesn't really exist, where no one really knows how to use maps. Like, you know, we don't learn how, yeah, it's not part of our experience really to navigate through maps.
So when you said you were in like this place near in the Alps, right? You navigated using a map.
Yeah, everything was like navigating. You can navigate use a map. Like everyone, it's, you know, you see these, you get these road maps in like every little shop that people pick up when before they go on holiday, you know. um but like over here especially, and that's, you know, when they travel around. But over here, like, you know, my experience of traveling around in an archipelago is that, I mean, we don't get to navigate. We don't have this real practice navigating through land. You know, if you want to get to another province, you normally have to get on a boat, and navigating on sea is completely different.
Right.
You know, because it's like a whole, like, you can cross certain it could be at sea in a outrigger boat for 4 or 5 hours before you hit the next island. But navigating through that, and I always found that interesting. You know, if I put it next to this practice of map reading on land, is that it's completely different practice if you try to navigate on water.
I wonder also whether the experience of living in a city for you, let's say Manila, right?
Hmm?
Where we navigate not using maps, but via like either memory or like
Yes.
what maybe one might call emotional navigation. So you
Yeah.
remember, let's say, you have to walk this way and then turn that way, and then
Yeah.
that, landmark, you turn left or right, that kind of navigation, right? Like rather than like using a map. The other thing that maybe comes to mind is like in Southeast Asia, right? And this is maybe, dating back like centuries, people who travel, right? Let's say between islands using boats, their knowledge of the seas was like really quite incredible, really
Yeah.
sophisticated, and they would be able to navigate um, not just by like looking at the stars, but by even looking at, let's say, waves and like the
Yeah.
sounds of the
Yeah.
ocean, things like that.
Yeah.
Um, these days, we normally associate that with like a lot of Pacific cultures, right? Like Polynesians, for
Yeah.
example, they are supposedly able to like lie flat on a boat and
Mm.
on like the movement of the boat, right? They can
Yeah.
like navigate. Um, so I'm wondering whether you're tapping also into these like Southeast Asian like forms of like navigation. Uh,
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. I think, yeah, I definitely am, because it's something that, I mean, that's what I'm used to. That's what I know, you know, and every time I used to, because my mother had a traveling culture show when I was growing up. And because no one could take care of me, she would drag me with her, traveling all throughout the islands, you know, go up north, down south, and hop from one boat, and then 4 hours on a boat, next island, hop another boat, you know, this whole idea of island hopping. And then on the way, like when I was younger, I remember meeting all of these boatmen. And these are the locals, you know, who live in the island. And then that's their way of life, like taking tourists around or renting out outrigger boats and making their own boats and just, you know, renting it out. And like every time it was time to go, like obviously, you know, you're always like, if you're working on a show, there's always a schedule, you know, 6 a.m., this and that. But there are a lot of times that, oh, we can't go now. We can only leave at around 7:30 because the tide is too high and then we won't be able to see where we're going. You know, they have their own language.
Yeah, no, but that's great also because like
And
maybe you guys had your own schedule, right? But then
yeah,
you were forced to like work with nature's like schedule, right? Or
exactly.
nature's time. Um,
Yeah. Like, you know, you try to go to like, you're trying to go, there's this beautiful island we have to go to, but we can only go there at 10 a.m. and we have to leave at 2 p.m. because it disappears.
right.
You know, so this whole, you know, it's
Yeah.
always changing, especially because you're around this water, you know, it's more changeable than you know, other landscapes
Yeah,
because things
totally.
disappear and all of that.
In Southeast Asia, right? Like centuries
Yeah.
ago, all these like travelers would like they had to wait for the wind to literally like change direction before their ships could like move, right?
Yes. Yep. And I think it's also interesting because like everything is navigated by water. I mean, you know, like we're connected to Southeast Asia, not by land, but by water. You know, it's easier to get at the tip of the Philippines and Mindanao. It's close. It's easier to get to Malaysia than it is to get to Manila. You can go in a couple of hours by boat from Sabah to Tawi-Tawi, the tip of Mindanao, than it is from Tawi-Tawi to Manila in the same country. You know, so we're all connected by that, and our similarities in culture can be seen. Like, you know, the people in Mindanao is closer to, you know, the people culturally is closer to people in Borneo and Malaysia
Mm.
and all that than it is like up north.
Based on these like long geographical and historical,
Yeah, yeah,
right? Yeah.
yeah.
Mm.
You know, so, and that interests me because especially particularly with that kind of with that work with maps is because, you know, when you look at that, and they're all different countries connected, just divided by a range of mountains,
Mm.
you know, and they're culturally, they're all also, they're, to think that they're quite different, you
Culturally,
know.
they share a lot in common, right? Because of the
Yeah,
accent.
yeah,
And it,
but they're still separate, they're still
yeah.
so, you know, it's harder for them to bring their culture across certain places because of those mountains,
Mm,
you know, like the language is different,
right.
you know. I mean, you have people down south, like, you know, the people who live on the sea
Yeah.
by Sabah that actually speak um Bahasa, you know, so
Let's go to let's talk about that um, photo that has been very influential for you. Um, and it's actually um, the left photo that's projected on this screen,
yes,
the
this
YouTube
one, yeah,
exhibition, which unfortunately is a little bit cut off here. But
yeah.
could you tell me that experience leading up to that taking of that photo for you?
Yeah, well, you know, that photo is something I still, yeah, like you said, I still go back to. It's like a stock photo that's still very, very, uh, very highly charged and very important in my practice still. Um, and what that particular photo I took in Davao del Sur in Mindanao, which is literally the one of the southern tips of the archipelago, and it's the province or the part of the province that's directly facing the Pacific. So on the way there, in that around that island, around that particular island, is if you're the drive there is actually pretty interesting because you're on an ocean drive, and then you just see the Pacific, and the next island will probably, I don't know, Hawaii, and or one of those like small islands in between the Philippines and Hawaii. There's nothing but ocean. And I found that whole idea, like that whole place, really interesting because you're literally at the tip of the world, like edge of the world almost, you know. And that place is a place that we just found
You were
our happy.
traveling with your family, right?
I was traveling with my cousins, and it wasn't even planned. We decided to go to this area with water, this famous, really nice waterfall, and that was on the way up the hill, you know. And then on the way up the hill, I just asked if we could stop because it was a very captivating sort of image, even if you're when you know even when I was there, and I felt like I had to get it. I'd have to take a photo because even like that photo was not even on a nice camera. I didn't have a nice camera, but I just felt like, you know, I had to take a photo of it to kind of capture this particular image because it's exactly sort of like that ideal like tropical place island in my head that you think of, you know. And it's something that I think look at like that because I'm very be living in a city, you know, even in the same country, it's still quite it's still quite far from me, from my experience.
I
So
wonder, I wonder whether that image or that photo evokes something in memory for you, even as though you were seeing it there, right? Um, that it almost triggered something maybe deep within you. Um,
I think, I mean, not particularly. I think it's just I just remember um looking at it and just thinking, oh, it was just so perfect, you know, like it felt like a perfect place, almost utopian. So when I look at it, even now, when I look at it, it looks like, oh, you know, does the place actually exist? It's somewhere in, you know, sometimes I think like maybe it doesn't because it's just so perfect. You know, have a little
yeah,
like river running through and all of that in the
it,
mountains. So it's like
it seemed it seemed unreal, maybe too
it
good
seems unreal.
to be true, maybe a little bit uncanny as well.
Yeah, yeah. It was just such a strange and beautiful place, you know, when I looked at it. And I just thought it was really, it was, I mean, it's just something that I go back to. And the fact that also that it's in the part of the Philippines that's, you know, quite personal to me in a sense, because my family grew up there. My family is from that region of the Philippines in Mindanao, which is really, if you think about, if you really look at, you know, Philippine culture and even politics, is just really separate from, you know, what the world knows and what understands about us. It's like the Wild West.
Right. And in terms of like Mindanao and the Filipino imaginary, right? Let's say
Mm-hmm.
the relationship between like the Mindanao South and like the Luzon North, um, or maybe
North.
the relationship between like the city and like the countryside. There's a way in which Mindanao stands also for something that's like maybe older and more primitive. So
Yeah.
interesting when you saw that photo. Um, I don't think it was just tapping into like your own, you know, let's say interests and like desires and like memories. I think you were also like channeling something in the culture as well.
Yeah. I
And
think,
it
yeah.
may be also that you were unconsciously also replicating, I think, the colonial gaze.
I think so. I think so because, like, I mean, you know, what a lot of people don't really understand about Mindanao, is even Filipinos, is that when we were colonized by the Spaniards in the 300 years, Mindanao is the one area that they couldn't penetrate. They couldn't, like, you know, the way things, politics and things are done, everything in Mindanao has evolved from that kind of pre-colonial notions of, it's very tribal down there. And it still is, those are all the indigenous tribes are still so many different languages and everything. That, it's smaller now, it's not as strong now, but it still exists, and it has not really, it's unlike Luzon up north where the influence of the West is very much seen, a lot of aspects of the culture up north, food, language, everything has been sort of evolved and influenced by our colonial past. But in Mindanao, it's like it's different. The way they do politics is different. It's still very much a tribal culture. I mean, the Philippines is, but most particularly Mindanao. So it's for me, in a sense, it's like almost like the untouched kind of image of, so if you're looking at like colonialism, I mean, it's still kind of can almost in my head like exist as sort of like that little protected bubble of it, that still has connections with its pre-colonial rather than just like
Yeah.
post-colonial,
But at the same time, I would say that that image for you isn't just like romanticizing that place, right? Or
Mm.
it's not simply a picturesque image. And we can talk also about how the landscape tradition, right, coming from the West, or at least the way it evolved in the West, very much bound up with like power, right? Uh,
Yes. Yeah.
the colonial gaze as like associated with like
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
genre of landscape painting is definitely there. But again, I would say that that image for you isn't simply romanticizing. There's almost
Yeah.
like you're also channeling like the resistance of Mindanao.
Yeah. Yes, I think so. I think it's really, I mean, that's also the reason why, like, that's also the reason why, like, going back to the works of my maps, you know, and that's also the reason why I was interested in maps to begin with, because, how maps are read, how maps of the world are read has always been um, biased. They always show like the west, the east, where we are is the east, the north and the south, and there's always a power structure. And there is still a power structure there in the way we look at the world.
Yeah, you could say it being these
Maps.
very colonial constructs, right?
Exactly, it's a colonial construct, and the same way, and I think that's where, like, where this why this picture is so important for me, is because it sort of taps into that conversation of the power structure and how, like, how that place exists. So where does that place exist in this whole the politics of identity and colonial identity? How does that Where does that where does that place exist in your head, or in my head? How do people see that? Because people look at it, and then, and I get asked, like, like, oh, it's somewhere down east, and I'm thinking, like, what is this down east? Like, you know for us, it's the center. If we centralize ourselves
Yeah.
as Filipinos, as Southeast Asians, like as Asians, like, we could be the center, but we become sort of like that east from their perspective. But how do we see it? What kind of conversation can we have if we start to look at it from our perspective as being the center?
Mhm.
you know so how will that conversation go when you know I guess that's sort of like how what I'm thinking, like, sometimes, like, what makes me what still why that photo still makes me think, because for me, it allows me to have that continuing conversation within my practice, you know so
I'm curious as to why, like, when we talk about that photo, right? That image was a kind of, like you say, a stock photo that you keep returning to repeatedly.
Yeah.
A stock photo is, in a way, a kind of cliche.
Yeah.
Um, but curious, I'm curious as to why uh, it's not exactly an ideal for you, or there's a way in which like you're okay that it's kind of like a cliche.
What
Do
do
you
you
think
mean?
it's a cliche? Well,
Sorry?
this image, right, of that Mindanao landscape,
Mm-hmm.
um, on the one hand, it seems like like
Cliche, yeah.
an impossible image, right?
Yeah.
Maybe an ideal that
Yeah.
you can't really get to. On the other hand, there's a way it's at the same time a little bit cliched.
Mm-hmm.
But then, like, I was talking to you and you said like you're not really bothered by the fact that it's like a stock photo. Um,
Yeah. No, I'm not really. I'm not really that bothered about it because I think maybe because I haven't really thought about it that separately from or talked about that separately from my experience of it. I'm not there yet. So, when I go back to it, when I look at it, I'm still connected to it, you know? So like I talk about the ideal place and all of that, but it's sort of like it's ideal place, but also I'm connected to it. And that line hasn't been severed yet. So if I become alienated from that image
yeah.
completely, then I can probably have that sort of that I start to have that conversation about it, you know. But I'm not there yet.
Okay.
I'll probably get there, Maybe when I go back, I think that's why I feel like I have to go back because it's different if you actually see it again, if it's still the same,
Hmm.
and then that photo will become that sort of cliched that I will have that relationship with it, and I will have that conversation, be able to have the conversation about it.
Yeah, and that photo will be less like generative for you, right? Or less.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So, but I'm not there yet. I can say honestly that I'm not there yet.
Okay. Um, Louis, could you talk about like your experience of like living in a city? So let's say Manila, right? I'm curious as to whether your experience of the city condition like photos like these, right? Or even that primal photo we're talking about. Um, Insofar as like living in a city is very different from like living in the countryside, and
Yeah.
there's a way in which like when you leave the city sometimes, right, and go to the countryside, you're bringing the city along with you. You don't
Yes.
necessarily go immediately to the countryside, right?
Yeah.
Including what you see when you go to the countryside, right? Can you talk about what the city, living in a city is like, what it means in terms of landscape, and yeah.
I mean, like living in a city, you don't have that connection with landscape. I think landscape as a construct exists because of cities,
Mhm.
because we live in cities. And I mean, that's the reason, what's also one reason why, the whole idea of astrology of like, I remember talking about in one of my shows is this researcher's work, this researcher Burkhart's work on landscape and why it's beautiful and why it's this and that is the fact. And what's interesting about it is that it really, landscape as a construct is beautiful because big, and it exists because we live in cities. We're having that conversation about landscape because we live in cities, you know and that's how I feel. That's the role that being in like a city place within my practice and my research is because I mean I look at it in that way because I don't have a relationship with it in that sense. Something like I deal with the idea of landscape in my work is because, or like nature is because,
You don't
I experience it, but it's not part of my experience
okay.
living, in a city in that sense.
Yeah.
I don't know.
I
Yeah.
think the connection with like landscapes and like the city countryside relationship, right? I think it goes back, centuries all the way to like, let's say 15th century, 15th, 16th century, right? Let's say when Leonardo did like the first landscape image, or 16th century in the north when like all these like, Netherlandish people like
Mm-hmm.
did landscape imagery. I think they were going outside of the city very
Yeah.
consciously to make these
Yeah.
landscape images, right? So it's like the landscape is like the other of the city, right?
It really is. I mean, it's like something that exists outside of, it exists because of the city.
Right.
And we're talking about it because of the fact that, we all live in cities now, So, yeah. So that's sort of like, yeah.
So this strollology, right? Do you feel like walking is one way to like, let's say, recapture a kind of more connected relationship with the land? Uh,
I think so. And that's something that I experienced, that I had to experience on my own, that I really had to experience uh, to be able to say that it really does, but it does in a sense that it just sort of like allows you, or allowed me to make sense of where I am, obviously. And I thought it's particularly interesting because this whole idea of this interest in like walking and navigating and everything came from from going on a residency in France for 3 months, and then all we could do is really walk. And I remember like every day I'd go on a walk, a different path through a mountain, 1 hour, 2 hour walk. And I couldn't believe how easy it was to follow a map that you can get in like cigarette stores or whatever, and then you won't get lost if you follow that map. And I thought that whole practice was incredible because, living in the Philippines, living in the city where we all, even the following maps will get you lost. We don't have that. No one walks here. Like going for a walk, the whole idea of like, why, the whole idea of like, oh, let's go for a walk just for leisure. Like,
yeah,
why?
yeah.
Take a car, go somewhere, you know?
No, I mean, a lot of people assume that like walking culture is like universal, but it's not.
No, it's not.
Uh,
It's not.
and
I
in
think I don't know what it is. Like maybe for me, I think it's a very first world thing. Coming from a developing country. I mean,
in
it's very first world. Like you enjoy your
Singapore,
walk.
right?
People here are sort of like trying to figure out how to, you know what I mean? So
In Singapore, where I grew up, right? We never used to go for walks.
it's also
Why?
too hot,
Why?
right?
Because it was too hot. Yeah,
Exactly.
yeah. So we go from place to place, in like buses or like
Yeah.
drive a car, but you never go
Where
for
there's air conditioning. See,
yeah,
air conditioning is your best friend, right?
yeah. No, in Singapore we go from air conditioned place to place.
Yeah. Yeah, it's exactly the same. So over here, it's just like, why are you going to walk when it's just so hot? You get to that place and you're like drenched. So it's not a comfortable, and it's not something you do for leisure, really. So I always say it's like, oh, it's the other world thing. It's another world thing. It's not this world, you know. So, and I thought that's fine. That's what I found. Obviously, that's why I find it so interesting, because it's completely different from what I'm used to. So, thought it could come up with an interesting sort of conversation around it. No, so
Another experience I have of like living in a city, right? In Singapore, when I was young, I never liked going to the beach in Singapore, right? Just because it
Mhm.
was like always really hot and there's something about the humidity and the beach that I didn't really like. So when I was young, I would always like, we swim in swimming pools,
Yeah.
and it would also be cooler, right? Like the water was not salty.
Yeah.
So it was only much later when I went to like Europe and the United States. Uh, my experience of the beach was like completely different. I start to like the experience of like, a beach. So my whole conception of like being on a beach, right? It's actually very like Western.
Yeah.
Just because of, this uh, experience I had with like Singapore when I was like young.
Yeah.
So it,
It really affects you, like, you go, like, you start to enjoy certain things when you're away, but you would never do that when you're home.
mhm.
Like walking, I love going on walks. I love it. Like, I love like exploring and going this and going through whatever. Never do that here. Like, get in my car and I'll go, but I'm not gonna do that here. Like, so there are just certain things that you allow yourself to do when you're away, and then it makes you think like, oh, it's completely, that's what makes it feel like a completely different place, because you're doing things completely differently. So
One thing maybe to bring up before we end, there's a way I like how you're in your work, right? You're very responsive to and specific about place.
mm-hmm.
So let's say this whole Mindanao thing we were talking about, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, like the more I learn about your work, the more I kind of appreciate that you're very like specific about place. Um, and also I think where the generalities are, like let's say maps as particular kinds of abstractions, right? Also where maybe your responsiveness to place comes also from an awareness of like where these kind of abstractions of place are.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I don't have a good follow-up.
Yeah. No. No, I think that, no, I mean, that's true though, because like, I mean, um I tap into these ideas of place and sort of navigating like cultures or place and identities and stuff, but it, it's not something that I really sort of straightforwardly talk about in my
Yeah,
practice,
or there's a way in which you can't like be so explicit about it or
Yeah.
it directly in your art, right? Because it won't
Yeah.
sort of like come through. Uh,
Yeah.
and maybe the genuineness of the art comes from the fact that you approach it indirectly.
Yeah, I think so. And also it's it's there, but I allow it to become that on its own with the work, because it's because it is there,
Right.
and that's never going to it's not going to disappear,
Or,
and you'll see it.
right. Or
You'll know.
letting it come through in the work, right?
Yeah, I just let it come through in the work, with the images I choose, and that's why this particular image is particular, because not only is it just specific, because it's also specific, connected to my experience, to me, you know
And
so
it's also the materials that you choose, right?
yeah, yeah, so it's you know it's um I'll just let the work will talk about it on its own, and I think that's what allows me to be able to continue this research, because the work does talk about it. It will continue to talk about it, so something happens when you make something and you put it out there. Something happens to the work. that's separate from you already. So in that sense, that's what I allow the work to do. And I think it is doing that, and then I'll get from it, go back, work again, come out. I think that's also why I go back to that photo, because whatever I do after with that photo, it's completely different. What I did when I first made it, when I first took it, the first work I did based off of it is completely different from what I'm doing, what I did with it now. It's everything evolves. Even if you look at the same things, if you look at
You're not
use the
looking
same
at it with the
images.
same eyes again, too, right?
Sorry.
You're not looking at that photo with the same eyes again.
Yeah.
You're like
Yeah.
in person,
But
right?
also different eyes, because the way you go through it is a process. The thought process that comes with it when I work through, the next throughout the year with the same, with other images, it comes out different. It changes. Oh.
Shall we end here?
Yeah.
I think that was.
Yeah.
Thanks so much for sharing your work with me, and
Thank you for having this conversation.
it was great talking to you.
Likewise. Likewise.